Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hello, this is the Great Woman in Compliance podcast with Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine. I'm Mary Shirley, and today I have a lovely guest with me. I'd like to introduce to you all Sofia El Mansouri. Sofia, welcome. Tell us about your career and journey to compliance.
Good morning, Mary, and thanks for the opportunity here today. So my journey to compliance started quite early in my career. Shortly after I obtained my bachelor's in the US, I moved to Dubai, where I was hired by a US company who had just settled with the SEC for improper payments to government officials in the Middle East and also to Iraq under the UN Oil for Food program. So having gone through this proceeding, the company required the establishment of a legal and compliance division for their Middle East operations, and I quickly developed a liking to it. Coming from a corrupt country myself, I suppose I found a purpose in fighting corruption. Unfortunately, we have to say it how it is. So I developed a liking to it, and I found in it a purpose, to fight corruption and reduce poverty, with an aim to apply this best practice to my own country one day, eventually. So that's how I started my journey. But as I went on into my career, most of my roles were dual legal compliance roles, which can be quite a difficult issue to balance at times.
Right.
Conflict.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think you're familiar with with that. So due to certain conflicts between the two scopes, I decided later on in my career that I was going to focus the rest of my career on compliance, 300%.
And what was it about compliance as opposed to the corporate commercial side of legal that appealed to you?
Well, to be honest, as I've mentioned, compliance had more of a, I found more of a cause in it than legal. Compliance was, for me, was a way to uphold the rule of law, to enforce, obviously, the laws which society put into place. Rather, legal also, I'm not going to sit here and bash our legal colleagues. That's not my aim at all.
Yes.
But in compliance, I found more of a purpose, a reason to go to work every day, which resonated with my own beliefs.
Yeah, I think some consider it to be almost a calling, if you will. And I hear that much more with compliance than I do with law. Absolutely.
Essentially, when I studied law, I had in mind to do the same thing. But unfortunately, later on in my career, I found out that law, especially commercial law, could unfortunately assist into concealing wrongdoing rather than stopping.
Right, the role of the defender in a company.
Absolutely.
So, Sofia, you originally hail from Morocco. Will you tell us about the development of anti-corruption in Morocco, including some of the enforcement activity?
Absolutely. So you touch on a subject which is very close to my heart. Obviously, Morocco is my home country. So if we may discuss the developments in Morocco, for more than 15 years now, Morocco has embarked on a complex process to fight corruption. So it announced earlier this year its strategy to combat corruption. And the National Anti-Corruption Commission expects a radical change by 2021. 91 projects have been announced for the upcoming 2 years, with a very optimistic aim of raising 17 places in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Now, on what has been done so far, several actions have emerged, both at the legislative and regulatory level. So there's been the enactment of the INPPLC Act. There's been also enactment of whistleblower protection, both for public servants and citizens in general. the Right of Access to Information Act. And in parallel, it is also launching a strategy to fight money laundering. And this is just to name a few developments. At citizen level, the government is aiming for simplification of administrative procedures and more awareness raising campaigns for citizens and users. So in addition to all this, a whole program has been dedicated to the private sector and includes important measures, including support for companies to adopt anti-corruption compliance standards, recognizing the role and importance of the private sector, and obviously recognizing that the private sector represents an essential ally in the prevention and fight against corruption.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, on the legislative level, Morocco is taking some important steps to prepare the next amendments of the Penal Code, which provisions corporate criminal liability for bribery and the criminalization of illicit enrichment. And finally, on the enforcement front, we are starting to see more prosecution of government officials, which I know is what every compliance officer is looking for. But yes, we are starting to see more of that, and notably mayors, police officers, and also judges. So enforcement has been recognized as a necessary measure for continuous improvement. We are not there yet, but Morocco is working really hard towards improvement.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And like me, you've lived and worked in the Middle East, but spent a lot longer than I did, and you traversed both Dubai and Abu Dhabi, although for those of you unfamiliar, Dubai and Abu Dhabi are pretty close. It was easy enough to head out to Abu Dhabi for a day trip, just kind of 45 minutes to an hour to head out there. When I was based in Dubai, which was 5 years ago now, that time's gone so fast, the compliance community was quite small and compliance jobs would come up fairly infrequently. Tell us, what is it like out there these days, the compliance community and compliance as a whole?
Well, so just like you, when I started my career in the UAE a decade ago, the compliance community was almost non-existent. To be honest, most compliance professionals were essentially legal professionals or audit professionals, but no official denomination, of a compliance function, except maybe in the banking sector or the pharmaceutical. Yeah. Now, today, the UAE compliance community is thriving. There's a growing network of professionals who work for multinationals, banks, even local companies. I wouldn't say that compliance jobs are pouring today, but we are certainly starting to see. We're certainly starting to see a sharp increase in demand for compliance professionals in the region, which is honestly quite satisfying.
Yes, I agree. So thinking about some of the biggest risks that compliance officers in the Middle East are looking to protect their companies from, what can you share on that?
Yes, so the Middle East is obviously concern, it's an area of concern. It's often considered a high-risk region by multinationals. Outside from its geopolitical risks, compliance officers in the region would usually look at their third-party risks, like any other regions, but perhaps more so in the Middle East with regards to agents, distributors, resellers, etc. With the Middle East being usually sales operations, from big multinationals. So you will have a lot more third-party risk happening, in the region. Of course, given that every company has a different risk profiles, some officers may focus on anti-bribery and corruption, some on conflicts of interest, some on export control issues, some on sanctions, some on money laundering. GDPR and data privacy have also grown in focus, antitrust and competition for some. So it all depends on the industry and the exposure of the company, I suppose.
So very similar key subject matter areas as for all of the other regions.
Absolutely. Very similar. I believe, when multinationals look to expand into the Middle East, they bring with them their best practice and what they're looking to achieve on a compliance front. So they'll essentially export their either European or US best practice, for example, to the region.
What are some of the questions compliance officers living outside the Middle East but covering the region should be asking local staff to make sure that they're not missing anything in terms of cultural practices that they could be advising on in relation to compliance risk?
So I think one of the biggest ones for me would be the issue of bribery versus gift giving, which is very cultural in the region. Also, some other regions in Asia would have the similar. So that's something to be cognizant of. Gift giving is a very cultural thing in the Middle East. Now, the idea is to educate your business well enough, for them to understand the difference between what is considered, a gift and what is considered a lavish gift that's used for with the corrupt intent.
Yes.
So that's number one for me. Second point for me would be perhaps the issue of who's considered a government official as per the definition of most anti-corruption regimes. Now, the Middle East is very particular in the sense that chances are, if you're dealing with a local national, either they or a family member will be considered a government official. So it's very hard to not be dealing with a government official as well. Although I must say this issue is more prevalent in the GCC, in the Gulf countries than in the rest of the Middle East. You would find that more in UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc.
I think that's right. Absolutely. Thank you for those tips. That's great. You write exceptionally good LinkedIn posts. I view them as bite-sized thought leadership. Share with us, what's your secret to writing a good LinkedIn post that adds value for your community?
Thank you, Mary. I'm always pleasantly surprised at the commentary I'm getting on my posts.
Yeah, they're very popular.
Yeah, honestly, I did not aim to be popular. At all. Essentially, when I started writing on LinkedIn a couple of years ago, was perhaps to link a more isolated compliance community to Western best practice. I never intended for the reach to go beyond that, but now that it has, the secret is really quite simple. Number one, be transparent. And number two, be consistent. So just to give you an idea, a majority of the posts that I share are actual insights from law firms or compliance providers. I try to add a touch of personality to them, sometimes humor to lighten the seriousness of the topic. About 15% of my posts will also cover something personal, such as what I'm doing with my career, quotes, where I'm going in life, this sort of things. I suppose getting personal with your audience does give your post, a more transparent touch. So that's very important. You must connect with your audience for you to have a following. Finally, being consistent is key. Unfortunately, most people give up because they don't get too many views or comments when they start posting. Even me, when I started posting, I had barely 2 likes or 1 like. So, but everyone has to start from somewhere. If your goal is for your ideas to be heard, you must be consistent. Today you have 1 like, tomorrow you have 2, in 1 year you have 10, etc. You must be consistent.
Yes, and it's funny that you mentioned that. I was just thinking, I think I woke up in the middle of the night, and as I'm prone to do, I kind of check my emails, do a little bit of social media if it's 2 a.m. And just this last night when I woke up, I saw a post of yours come up on my feed. I'd already commented on it. and it was at 153 likes, which is incredible. And there was a lot of conversation in the thread itself. And don't get me wrong, we're not posting for getting likes, even though I think I'm of the Instagram generation, and people are, after followers and likes to plump themselves up. But what I mean by pointing that out is that you're getting a lot of engagement, and the fact that your message is being heard and being appreciated and reaching so many corners of the world, I just think is awesome. And it's very generous of you to keep being consistent. It takes time and it takes effort. And that's a part of your day where you could be doing something else. So thank you for being so generous with sharing.
Thank you, Mary. I think in general, and this is something which another compliance peer has mentioned in one of your earlier posts or earlier podcasts, we in general in the compliance community tend to be generous with our best practice. It's something which I have noticed. It's not simply me. I've simply followed the examples of other peers and more senior peers and law firms and other people who have been generous with their knowledge. And we've simply followed their example, and we continue spreading the good word.
Awesome. Well, let's move on to trade sanctions now. They're a really strong practice area of yours. And those of you, dear listener, you may remember listening to Gwen Hassan about the fundamentals of trade sanctions last year. We spoke on that topic. So, Sophia, I'm going to ask you to please build on that conversation by highlighting some of the trending patterns you've been noticing recently in trade governance.
Absolutely. So we'll just start by saying that, the area of trade compliance and trade governance is extremely fluid and extremely dynamic. So this year in particular has given trade professionals much to keep up with. So for the past 12 months have been extraordinarily busy for U.S. sanction policy in particular. Mm-hmm. Two main trends could be observed: a sharp increase in targeted sanctions to achieve U.S. strategic geopolitical goals, and several enforcement cases in a wide range of sectors that indicate that OFAC is setting higher standards for how companies should conduct. These trends are further reinforced, obviously, by the OFAC framework, which was published in May, and that has set the expectations of OFAC in that regards. Now, another development which has happened this year is OFAC has made it mandatory for companies to report blocked or rejected transactions to OFAC. And this is an area which was historically only required from financial institutions. So that's a big change, for companies. Now, with that said, the current administration's increasing reliance on sanctions to solve foreign policy problems is fueling concern among non-US companies, and it's fueling concern that the United States is abusing its financial power and prompting some governments and companies to seek ways to evade US measures or alternative supply chains,
right.
For example, in the UAE case, I'm not sure I'm saying their name right, but, we have, they were very vocal about it, in advertising the fact that they're seeking new supply chains to evade, obviously, US suppliers. Now, against this backdrop, of unilateral US sanctions, Europe has announced some recent initiatives, like, for example, Instex, which is a bartering mechanism. Other countries like Russia and China also might, all these countries might continue to try and create alternative financing channels. So they are looking for ways, basically, to make payments without the use of the US dollar. So if these countries are successful at this, this will add a new level of legal complexity for anyone that's involved in trade compliance, because you're now stuck, between a rock and a hard place, which you follow.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the most noteworthy developments, especially for anti-corruption professionals, is OFAC's activities under the Global Magnitsky Act. Again, another name which I'm difficulty saying. Magnitsky, I think that's how you say it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a sharp increase of OFAC sanctions under this act. These sanctions particularly target individuals, such as foreign government officials, and their associated entities and assets also. They're targeted usually for corruption and abuse of power. So that's very noteworthy, because just yesterday, to give you an example, OFAC marked the International Anti-Corruption Day with the designation of 17 individuals and 29 entities across Europe, Asia, America. That's a whole lot of people, to sanction in one day.
Yes.
So that's particularly fascinating because it opens entire new avenues, in the fight against corruption.
Absolutely. And marks the point, of course, that sanctions in particular is an area that can turn on a dime. You wake up one morning and there's so much work to do as a compliance professional, or to just read and absorb, because it can happen so very quickly.
Absolutely. It happens very, very quickly. And so another trend that we're starting to see is that the EU is very inspired by the US model, it seems. And, against this sanctions, which I've just mentioned, the EU is actively working to develop very similar regimes. So very soon it's going to be, for almost every compliance professional, a reality which they cannot ignore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Sofia, not only for your trade sanctions observations, but for taking the time to be with us. Lisa and I really appreciate it, and we were absolutely delighted to feature you today.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Lisa. Very much appreciate the opportunity today.
Wonderful. Well, one final thought for today is, as we go into 2020 now, wanted to share a piece of advice. So following on from Lisa's episode and mine at the end of last year, where we discussed the best piece of advice we've ever been given. Another great piece of advice that I got when I was first starting out was to keep a log of all of the major projects and accomplishments that I worked on throughout the year, so that when it came to performance review time, there was an easy reference point that you don't have to rack your brain trying to recall and remember what you'd done throughout the year. And I encourage you to take this one step further. It's a great idea, what was told to me, and then how I've used it as well going forward, is to also apply that log for when you're job hunting. So when you're in the interview process and you get asked a question of, give me an example of when you've got this great history of your achievements and projects that you've worked on, to be able to give great examples off the top of your head and not scrabble for something in what is already a fairly high pressure moment. And again, one step further is to take the opportunity whilst you're thinking about and tracking your the things that you've done, is to take time to reflect on those projects and what you could have done better. Not only is that fantastic for yourself in terms of the self-awareness of being able to move forward and develop yourself, but again, in the interview questions, when they ask you about situations that weren't so ideal, and they ask you the question of what would you have done differently next time, or how would you have approached it to mitigate some of the consequences, you've again got this really well thought out response that you can give. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for listening in with us, and look out for our next episode in a week's time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.